Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network.
Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over.
Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. This is our 2 cents segment. We're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast. In the 2 cents segment, we take a plain English look at the big 3 property news stories of the week, and I'm joined by Mr. Chris Bates. Welcome, Chris. How's your week been?
Mate, it's been good actually. I'm finally coming out of the sickness, the bubble, I guess.
Well, it's been a while. You've been crook for weeks.
Yeah, about a month. It's the little nuclear weapons, the kids constantly saying, deal with that one, Dad. But yeah, no, it was a good weekend, a good long weekend. We went down the South Coast, down to sort of Jiroa, Gerringong, with some friends with young kids as well. And it was, it was awesome. Made some stick castles on the beach and yeah,
I love it down there. Yeah, I used to stay at Gerringong quite a bit and Jiroa Shores. Actually got married down there at Kiama. A few years under the bridge since then, but it's such a beautiful part of the world to visit.
Yeah, same as me, actually. I didn't know that. I got down sort of a bit further south, down to Tarara, which is sort of down near Nowra on the river there. So
superb,
that's where we got married. So there you go. What about yourself, Pete? What have you been up to?
Little personal finance tip for you. Don't invite anybody to your wedding. It'll save you thousands. So, yeah, it was too hard for us. All of our friends were all dotted over New Zealand, UK, Europe. And it was when we started putting the list together, it's like, should we just do this on the beach? 2 people, photographer. Yeah, job done. So, yeah, what's happening here? I'm actually over in England this week. It's been roasting hot. And the Ashes cricket starts this week, so really excited about that, obviously. I usually get really excited for the first 2 tests until England get dusted and then kind of gradually lose interest as the series goes on. So, but yeah, we'll see how we go. They tend to do better in England than in Australia. So every Sunday morning at 7 a.m, you'll find our 2 cents podcast episode waiting for you in your podcast player. And these are a bit of fun because each week we just cover the big 3 stories of the week, but also anything you want to know about. So do send us your questions. We'll be guided by you, whatever's topical, whatever's hot and whatever's not. So you'll find links in the show notes as well to the stories we're talking about. So Chris, the big 3 news stories of this week. We actually said last week we'd do an interest rates deep dive because we got the cash rate hike last week, but we didn't really go deep into it. So we're going to talk a bit about that first and what might happen if we get further rate hikes. Secondly, a related story that's been doing the rounds. Does Australia have to have a recession to bring down inflation? Some of the major bank economists are saying it's kind of 50-50 now as to whether Australia sinks into recession. New Zealand, I noticed this week, just into a technical recession already. And the third story, something a bit different. Australia's tourism rebound has suddenly come rocketing back and looks to be on track for record highs by the summer months. So we're going to take a look at what that means for the economy, maybe more spending, more inflation, and also what it might mean for the housing market as well, because it's just more fuel onto the fire there too. So those are our 3 stories, Chris. We kick off with the interest rates deep dive. You're the mortgage broker. Tell us what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I've always sort of said to clients, like, I think the 4% RBA rate is what everyone's been thinking about in their head, right? And so the market, I think, had been pricing in a 4% RBA rate, and that's what a lot of buyers have been doing all the way back to, sort of September, sort of August, July last year. I think when the market corrected so fast was because buyers very quickly corrected their budgets to much higher rates, hence why the market corrected. It wasn't like a slow increase in rates and so a slow decline in the market. It was a rapid fire increase in rates, and so it was a massive decline fast. We saw prices correct 15, 20+% in months. And so I think the 4% was there's always these, stress tests or tipping points where buyers affected. And I do think the 4% mark was it. So it has surprised a lot of people in the last couple of months that it's gone this. And, there's talk of more rates in coming as well. But I mean, there's two sides to this story in the property market. There's buyers and then there's sellers, right? And so I think, and then there's people in the market, right, who are just got debt and holding on, right? So the interesting thing, I guess, with those three pools, I guess, the current people with debt, it's interesting. We had basically zero arrear loans, and we still do. We've got one client who's just going onto a payment plan, and I think it's a work issue there. He may mean redundant. He's a bit older actually in terms of the client base we've got. But other than that, this week we have had actually two clients reach out to us who, are wanting to speak to the banks because they're really feeling the pinch. And I think so there is this going to be, but I do think in these situations, the bank are going to work with these clients. They have got equity. They're both in jobs, but it's just they're feeling pressure with the rate. So I do think this is going to be a bit of a stressful time. Now, mortgage rates, even though the RBA has gone up to 4.1, we're still getting mortgage rates in the 5.6-ish, which is crazy, right? The margin on top of the cash rate is only 1.5%. We used to always say if you could get under 2%, that was a really good rate. So bank rates haven't gone up as fast as RBA rates, right? So that's the thing to sort of think through here. Ultimately, budgets have dropped a little bit more. So every time the RBA increases rates, that increases the bank rates, which reduces how much people can borrow. So I think, the last two rate increases, another 5% cut to borrowing capacity, which is meaningful, right? And especially if they go another couple of times, that's another, 5 or, maybe even up to 10%, depending on how high they go. So borrowing capacity is ridiculously tight. We get lots of clients coming to us and about 40 to 50% can't refinance. And that's people, and a lot of them are investors, to be honest, who've got multiple properties. And even though there's, been some innovation, well, not innovation, but the banks are able to do it on lower assessment rates. That's a bit of it. We're not covering that today, but that's been a story in the news with APRA kind of telling the banks off or telling them to be a bit careful. So yeah, I do think there's a bit of debt stress building, right? Especially in the investor market. And then the recent purchases in 2021 mainly. And I think that, the banks are going to work with those customers, but I do think investors are going to start to come out of some properties, especially if we sit here for another 6 to 12 months, they can't refinance. They're going to make a call to sell one of their properties potentially. So not all of them, because they'll just get one that'll get them through, the period. That's my overall take on the current buyers, and I'm sort of hogging the microphone here, Pete. I'll pass it to you in a sec. But
I was enjoying the listen, Chris. Fire away. I'll have a cup of tea. You keep talking.
So the buyers, I definitely think they're having borrowing capacity issues. But I also think that that's going to cool that FOMO jet. That FOMO was definitely in the market. You could see that through clearance rates. You could see that through poor properties getting big prices. Like I get frustrated when I go on a Saturday night and I read through the auction results. I think they paid that for that. Like that. This is not good, right? We don't want to see big prices on poor properties. It's a sign of people, not making great decisions, to be honest. So I do think that FOMO is going to get cooled, and I think buyers are going to be more picky, and they're going to be more patient, which is actually what they should be always doing. And they think they're also going to have to adjust their budgets a little bit further because they're already going up to their max because their max was generally not enough. The sellers, you've got to think about this. Like 2 months ago, or even a month ago, I was getting, things from real estate agents. They're saying it's much more stable, this market, because of what's right. It's now a much better time to sell. You can transact much more safely because we're more sure about what price you're going to get, which was true. But if you're thinking now as a seller in June, and you usually list in August, September, October, would you want to sell in this market? You wouldn't. You wouldn't want to transact because there's all this fear and negativity. So I would park my upgrade plans. I would say, look, I'm not going to upgrade in this environment. I'm worried about whether I can find a better property. I'm worried about what price I'm going to get. I'm worried about my interest rates. I'm worried about my borrowing capacity. So I think we've already got this supply shortage. No stock came on in autumn. No stock came on in spring. No stock came on in autumn. And I think in this spring, we're going to be really disappointed again. So even though we've had this demand pullback, I think we're going to get a bigger pullback in supply. Because ultimately higher rates and uncertainty means that you just sit and hold. So that's going to really buffer or support the market. Now, there's two parts. This is in quality, affluent areas on better streets, the properties you really probably want to buy, either an investor or a home buyer. But there will be debt stress building in sort of greenfield housing estates. There will be debt stress building in high density apartments where a lot of investors and first home buyers have played. There will be debt stress in a lot of the areas that did lots of transactions in 21, 22, and high percentage of the market turned over in those years, which there are some markets where people really upgraded in those years. So that's my take, Pete. But I think the real concern is where do rates finish and how long do they stay there? And that's the key point, right? Like, how high do they go? That doesn't really matter that much. It's like, how long do they stay there for? And I think that's what people should be thinking about.
It's an interesting point you make about real estate agents. I remember reading a book years ago that was written by one of the top agents in Australia. And all the way through, the theme was like, well, it's a great time to buy. It's also a great time to sell. And I think that's the thing. Like, a real estate agent, in the end, it's a transactional industry. I actually got an email in the inbox this morning saying it's a great time to buy and sell, which kind of doesn't really make sense when you look at it objectively. So, yeah, sometimes you can take the real estate agent commentary with a bit of a pinch of salt. So yes, the Council of Financial Regulators met this week and reported the 3% lending buffer is basically staying in place. So that's not going to change until interest rates have peaked. I also know anecdotally of a couple of people, not in mortgage arrears, but actually approaching their brokers, approaching the banks about payment holidays or a payment plan. So yes, it's not... I think the trend over, the last 15 years really has been to try and take all of the risk out of the system. And I don't think that there'll be many forced sales by the banks. But you're right, the 2022 vintage of mortgages, prime RMBS 30-day delinquencies have shot up. Now, this is a plain English episode. What we're saying here is people who've borrowed recently are falling behind on their mortgages much more so than people who borrowed in the past. And that's the first time we've really seen that in a number of years. Through the pandemic, we had a lot of banks just let people go on to mortgage holidays, and there weren't many loans that went into arrears because of that. But we are starting to see signs of mortgage stress there. Now, in terms of the interest rates, that's interesting, your point on mortgage rates not going quite as high. I think if you look at savings rates now, you can get 5.5% on a savings account, which is something we haven't been able to say for a little while. Still not that many people. Household savings ratios are ebbing away, actually. They're very low now, falling all the way back to where they were before the pandemic and below. So the key question, I guess, Chris, is where do interest rates go to? Now, the Federal Reserve paused interest rates this week. Inflation seems to be under control. Producer prices, they're only up 1% over the year. So they've got all the way back to where they were in 2018. Inflation's down to 4%. Won't be long before it's down to 3%. In Australia, though, we're a long way behind, I guess, because Australia stayed locked down. International borders were closed for such a long time. Now, as we speak today, this is what markets are pricing. So we've got a cash rate target of 4.1%. We've got a terminal cash rate of pretty close to 4.5%. So we're kind of saying one more hike, maybe two, but then coming back down next year. And some of the major banks, especially CBA, are talking about significant interest rate cuts in 2024. Now, Chris, what I wanted to ask you is, let's say this is wrong. Markets are wrong. Inflation sticks around. Reserve Bank gets spooked and hikes the cash rate all the way up to, say, 5%. Let's war game this scenario. What happens if the cash rate goes to 5%, mortgage rates go up? As you mentioned, there's tight lending assessments for people who want to refinance. What happens in that scenario, do you think?
Look, I think if that's also aligned to a massive spike in unemployment, as in, so we're not getting a wage price in spiral, but people are actually losing their jobs. And this is the thing I think supporting the market, right? Our unemployment rate is still really low, and people are able to swap jobs, and people still are getting, wage increases, etc. I do think that's tempered a lot. Last year or the year before, we were getting lots of clients with big bumps in their salaries. A lot of people were confident around their future income. I do think people are a little bit more nervous and wanting to, because they're worried about a recession. So I think that's the key factor, right? Do we also see cash rate go up, but do we see unemployment rise dramatically? If not, then I think the banks will be invested in this. I think the borrowers will be invested in this. I think the sellers won't be forced to go to the market because they're still able to make things work. That's my worry, I guess. If we get to a 5% cash rate and then it falls straight away, right? Because that's like in the US. I mean, I was reading your blog on that this week, Pete, and I recommend all our listeners to read your blog to stay up to date. But it's like if we go high, but then we bring inflation that does the job, and then we start getting rate cuts, then people will know, well, I just need to hang on. And I think banks will be invested to say, well, I know your rates, it's not affordable now. What can you pay per month? We'll put a bit of a payment holiday in place or reduce your repayments, and because we know rate cuts are coming. And then maybe they can refinance as rate cuts come, and maybe APRA starts to step in with borrowing capacity changes, etc. So, I think that's the key thing for me is what happens to unemployment in that sort of environment as well. Do we see a major increase in that?
I think if the cash rate target went from 0 to 5%, I think a retail recession would be locked in. I think there would be a smouldering crater where the retail sector used to be. I see this week David Jones effectively leaked some of their like-for-like store sales to the media, and they've basically crashed over the last week or two. It's almost like it's a cry for help. They say, let's stop hiking the bloody rates because we're really not going to hit any targets here and it's all going backwards. I saw Domino's Pizza offering half-price pizzas this week, and then they cut their 7% delivery fee. And there's just all these things going on that suggest even some supermarket discounting we've seen over the last week or two. I think if we got to a 5% cash rate, yes, we'd see some more landlords selling. I think the supply of new housing would just disappear. I think developers would be going bust left, right, and centre. There were more rumours this week about major developers teetering on the brink of voluntary administration, and even just things like build to rent. It all made great sense when the cash rate was 0. But if you've got a cash rate of 5%, who's going to be investing in residential housing for the yields on offer? It just that would go out the window as well. So look, as you said, I think you're right. If we got to 5, it would be an absolute mess, but we'd probably be coming back down again pretty quickly, I suppose.
Yeah, the developer side and the build, I mean, they're already, like you say, crying for help as well. All the numbers I think we covered on last, 2009, our level of building is equal to, or that's what approvals are. So, and we're not seeing many clients looking to do any constructions or renos, and everyone just wants to sit on their hands. So I think it's going to really flow up the system. So your house and land, your new townhouses, your new apartments, your build to rent, your constructions, your renovations. I do think there's going to be a massive pullback. Everyone's going to start to tighten their belts. So, I mean, I guess this really leads into our second story. I mean, is, the recession we have to have. I mean, what's your thoughts, Pete? I mean, it's starting to become obviously a topical thing. A recession's coming. It's a really scary word, especially when we haven't had many here for a long time. What's your take on this? Is it just a technical recession and that's what we need to do, or is it really a long-lasting recession that you see unemployment go through the roof? Because they're two different recessions, right?
There are a few articles doing the rounds this week, and some of them would sort of say, well, now we're sort of looking at a 50-50 scenario. Do we drop into a recession or not? I think if you look at it, we're probably already in a per capita recession. And actually the Reserve Bank forecast, if you look at the GDP growth over the calendar year, well, after you account for population growth, which might be, say, 2%, we are probably going backwards on a per capita basis. New Zealand, a very slight negative growth this quarter, so they're actually in a technical recession already. I think, though, there was some cyclone disruption. I think if you took that out of the equation, there'd be just modest growth. I think if you look at some of the indicators that people like to look at, well, consumer confidence this week, well, basically nearly as low now as it was during the actual lockdown of the economy. So that doesn't look great. I think if you look at some of the subcomponents, time to buy a major household item plunged another 7.5 points. I mean, that's as low as we saw when the economy was literally locked up or not far off. So these are pretty bad figures. I think if you look at Westpac's survey, the thing that stands out to me there is that house price expectations, not only have they rocketed since October, they're still rising even in June. So I guess that's just a supply shortage thing. But yes, I think if you look for the leading indicators like NAB's business survey, things like forward orders, they're dropping. They're below zero now. So you don't really see that very often outside of a contractionary period for the economy. So I don't think, base case, I don't think we'll have a recession in Australia, but it might feel a bit like one because we could be going backwards on a per capita basis.
Yeah, it's so funny there. Overconfidence in the Australian property market, right? We've got consumer confidence at all-time lows. We've got interest rates going from 0 to over 4%. We're talking about a recession, but our expectations on future house price growth is really high. And there's an overconfidence that the property market will survive all sort of seas. And that is absolutely something that supports the property market, right? Like I guess if you compare that to what people's expectations are in the share market, right? We are nowhere near as confident with the share prices, right? We hate the volatility of it, even though long-term growth is, arguably probably better if you played in the, dollar for dollar in the share market, especially if you went global. And so, yeah, it always makes me laugh, right? The irony or the counter argument that house prices are going to go up in a recession. And it sort of makes sense as well because, in a recession, not everyone loses their jobs. Not everyone's doing, poor financially. You could have COVID was a prime example. Some businesses flourished during those years, and some businesses got absolutely, the tourism isn't or the retail got absolutely smashed, etc. And hospitality, etc. So I think you've just in this scenario, we get a higher interest rate. There is a recession. That doesn't mean that everyone's struggling financially. It's just unfortunately the reality. And in the property market, the people who are out in the market buying are the people who are doing well financially. You don't go and upgrade your home or buy your first home or buy an investment property if you're not doing well at that point financially. And so even in a recession, there'll be people who are opportunistic, seeing it as a good time to buy because there's less demand, wanting to upgrade, wanting to be are ready at that stage of life, whether they've got family needs or their business is doing well or their job's doing really well. They'll be the buyers in the market. Yes, there'll be less than what there is in a really boom market with low interest rates, but there'll still be buyers out there. And on the other side of the coin, you'll have a lot of sellers trying to hold on because they won't. Their expectations are it's not a good time to sell because expectations are prices are going to go up, and so that will buffer the market. And this is why a recession doesn't necessarily mean house prices are going to fall dramatically. It doesn't. It's not that simple.
Well, not every recession is like the global financial crisis was in Europe and the US, or not every recession is the Great Depression. I think one of the interesting things is you mentioned there the confidence, and I think there's definitely this thing. There's a narrative cycle in Australia. There's always something that's apparently going to cause the world to end. It was the COVID lockdowns. Before that, it was the Banking Royal Commission. Before that, it was the end of the mining boom. Then there was the GFC. There's always, I guess, something. I just wonder whether those house price expectations, if you remember back to the lockdowns, March 2020, and the Reserve Bank was talking about building a bridge to the other side. We're going to support the economy, support everybody's household payments and so on until we get through to the other side. Well, I wonder whether the interest rate story might end up being something similar. I think people, nobody's enjoying higher interest rates except for savers, of course. But I think a lot of households, they've heard these narratives over 5, 10, 20 years, and we've never really seen really big declines in housing prices. And I think people are already starting to look ahead to the peak of the interest rate cycle and coming back down the other side. Now, I saw CBA this week said that the cash rate will fall 1.25% in 2024, offering respite to mortgage holders. And they expect the rate cuts to be front-loaded into the early parts of the year, taking the cash rate back down to 3.1. I just wonder whether some of that narrative might start appearing, is that, yes, interest rates are bad, they're rising, but hang in there because we're going to get across to the other side. And actually, a load of the jobs figures, things like Seek's job advertisements down 22% from the highs, and there's other private government job ads figures starting to roll over. the inflation stories are getting better in other parts of the world. Oil prices are down. I just wonder whether people are going to start. They're not as panicked about interest rates as they were in October, November last year, paradoxically, even though interest rates are actually higher.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how the media play, because media is a big part of the confidence and the sentiment, right? And so they flip on a dime. And so they flip from, one day it could be the market's going to crash 15 to 25%. And then a week later on the front page, this market's going to go up 15%. Just like bank forecasts, to be honest.
Does that make a difference, do you reckon? I reckon it does make a difference. I think if you go to a barbecue and the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald is talking about 10% gains or 10% declines, I think it does change the conversation in the market.
Absolutely. And I think that's what, you got, the famous Chris Joy, right? He's holding fire, his hand in the fire. And even though he predicted prices would fall 15, 25%, if rates went up 1%, rates got up 4% and they only fell 10% and went back up. And he's still thinking that this is a false dawn, a dead cat bounce. These are all the sort of investment terminology that people. So this increase in prices is going to get given back straight away, and we're going to see big prices falls over the next 6 to 12 months. And SQM, I think they've sort of back in there. I think some of a big economist, I can't remember who exactly was yesterday. They were starting to talk about. Potentially the price gains are going to be given back. And so the media latch onto that story because I think that's going to sell more news and more advertisements. I do think that's going to potentially play into buyer sentiment again because people want to see what happens, right? Is this is this a false dawn? And I think that's going to be interesting to watch how the media behave over the next few months.
To be fair, if you'd have said to me, 15 months ago that the cash rate would go from 0 to 4, I would have thought there'd be more fallout than there has been, and appreciating there's always a lag with these things. But it's definitely fragmented out there. I had a client looking to buy a property in Melbourne this week, and the quoted range was, from memory, 4 to 4.5, and it went blasting over the top of the quoted range. There's a real shortage of quality stock out there.
Yeah.
And but it's, as you said, there's lots of different moving parts. I think if there's a big risk, I think it's where people were buying some of those properties sight unseen in regional Australia, maybe some of the coastal locations. Certainly saw this on the Sunshine Coast. There's properties getting listed, bang, 3.5, without even an inspection. I wonder whether with that trend reversing, but suddenly with mortgage rates spiking higher, well, if there's going to be some arrears and risks and big drops in prices, well, some of those sort of exuberant prices that were paid during the lockdowns, that could come into focus, I reckon. Yeah,
and I'm actually seeing a bit of an explosion in, when you say sight unseen, I think it's these buyers agents that are buying national, buying cheap, pretending they're a tech company, and pretending they've got the secret sauce to property investment, high yield and great capital growth. And, a lot of these companies have been around for 2 to 3 years, they haven't got the runs on the board through ups and downs in cycles. They don't have the local knowledge. All they're doing is basing their decisions on data, and buying, in places, and where it's easy to buy. Like, these are easy to buy investment properties. It's hard to sell in these places to get great prices. And so, just be cautious for our listeners. If you see these, amazing buyers agencies that are online, there's a lot of them out there now. I'm never going to name them, obviously, but there's a lot of them out there. And, they're buying cheap and cheerful properties that I think don't have the holy grail. And you just got to be really careful. And they are buying pretty much sight unseen because they don't know the local market. So for me, they might go and do an inspection, but they're not really thinking about things like a local would. They're just
there was a big there's a big company in the US that was doing something pretty similar to that, and algorithm based pricing, which was often real estate's a local asset class. It was never going to work, and it didn't. Would you ever buy a property without looking at it, Chris?
Personally, I it's a hard one, right? Like, I think if I saw a video and I had a buyer's agent in a state and I knew that local market, and but without anyone looking at it, absolutely not. And the reason is that it's not the property you're looking at; it's the neighbour. It's out the back. It's up the street. It's and there's a lot you're trying to suss out, not just with the property per se. the real estate photos will never show you what you really want to see, right? They never show you the privacy problem. They never show you the aspect problem. They never show you that there's a tree or there's a mechanic up the road, or there's all these little things that are deal breakers. They'll always show it at the best time that you won't know it's a rat run, for example, if you don't know the area. So there's so many things that you can rock up at a property, and any buyer can learn this lesson, because when you get ready on your Saturday and you put your list of properties down, you get excited over one, right? And you rock up, and it's before you even go in the front door, you just pull into the street, it's a waste of time. But on the listing and especially if you don't know the area, you get excited, right? And you go waste all your time going to this property, but as soon as you rock up, it's not the right property. And online, it looked like a great property. And so I think that's a good lesson people learn pretty quick when they're in the market.
Oh, yeah. I remember going years ago to look at properties in Woolloomooloo thinking, well, this looks pretty decent. The price is not too bad. And then you get inside and you realise, the photo of the kitchen that they put online was must have been in some way airbrushed or something, completely unlivable. So I wouldn't do it. In saying that, I have actually, personally, I have rented properties that I haven't been, because we travel a lot, but I think with that, it's a bit of a leap of faith, and obviously we're not renting cheap properties when we travel because we're a family of 4. But, with a rental, you'll suck it up if it's not quite right. But to buy somewhere, personally, I would never do that. I would use a buyer's agent to go through, and I've done that before in Geelong. But I wouldn't buy something without somebody trusted having a good inspection. Let's wrap up with our third story of the week, Chris. So there's been a massive rebound in tourism into Australia, to the extent that by the summer months, so the present rates of improvement, we're going to be back at record highs, which is quite remarkable when you think that tourism basically went to zero through the pandemic. Now, in April, there was more Aussies travelling overseas than people coming here because of the school holidays. And we've had the Easter disruption, but that seems to be dropping away now. More Aussies staying put, probably due to, I guess, the high airfares, which seems to be sticking around. So there's some implications here. I mean, obviously this is good for the economy on one level, but interest rates are a blunt tool, as you mentioned, and they don't impact thousands of people visiting Australia. It used to be mainly from China, that was the big country, but increasingly India, other parts of Asia, and other parts of the world. So this could actually lead to some more uncontrolled spending, potentially not good for inflation, and obviously pressure on accommodation as well, which is already very tight.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, this one, right? Like, we want people to come here to spend money for our economy, but maybe not right now when we're trying to kill the inflation bug. I guess, especially when you say, if you're thinking about someone with low debt right now, that, we've got lots of clients in this situation where they're not worried about that. They've got big buffers, etc. They want to live a good life. That's one of the issues we have here, right? We want to, live the best life. We don't want to save for tomorrow. And so I think a lot of people are still out there spending in the economy. And, I was down in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago and through a conference, and, all the restaurants were packed and the bars were packed, etc. And so up in Noosa a few months ago, it was packed as well. So, I do think this is going to be an issue. You think about someone in their later stage of life, they do like to spend their money that they've got in the bank. They're getting 5.5% on their cash right now. So, they're more likely to spend. So, Aussies going overseas, it's going to be interesting to see what happens, right? This is the time where people do start to go overseas, June, July, August, and get the winter, get away for the winter and go to Europe, etc. Or do Aussies just say, you know what, this is a year to sort of cut back that big holiday, right? Like, it's A, airfares are expensive, but B, I'm a bit worried about my mortgage. I'm a bit worried about my job. And so do we just go up to Noosa? Do we just go holiday locally like they did in COVID? And plus you get the international tourists. It's also an irony, right? That, you've got this global recession, global interest rates, but we're getting all-time high tourism. So, it shows that the market's not even, right? There's still people out there that are doing well financially. This is going to be probably a challenge that, the blunt tool of interest rate, it affects people with big mortgages.
The savings buffers, I mean, there were some big buffers that got built up over 2 or 3 years because people couldn't travel overseas. People didn't want to buy a new car because, well, we're transitioning to electric and there's a lot of uncertainty, and people built up big war chest. I think, those buffers are now being eroded, but certainly global travel. I saw flights in the US back to record highs, and people want to spend money. They don't want to leave it in their pocket too much. Chris, what do you reckon about finally the role of Airbnb? It's sometimes hard to get sort of solid numbers on this, but I know loads of people. I can think of some examples of investors who've bought, in some cases, crappy apartments that just didn't deliver for them as an investment. And then suddenly Airbnb's come along. They're like, hang on, I can actually turn this into a cash flow investment. And I stayed in Sydney a little while back at Momans Point, and I think in the unit block I was staying in, it was something like about 60 Airbnb units out of a block of 80 or something of that nature. So this is obviously a significant part of the market now, and presumably for every property that's coming into the Airbnb pool, that's coming out of potentially the sort of private rental pool and maybe adding to some of those rental pressures?
Yeah, I think we should get a conversation with a friend of mine, Kieran at Made Comfy, right? So they have an Airbnb business. They do thousands. They're, very tech driven. And what they do is look at the analytics of Airbnb and say, this property is not great on Airbnb. You're actually better to do in the long-term rental market, especially because rents have gone up. That's going to force people to say, you know what, I don't like the volatility of that, especially because my mortgage is more expensive. I just want a security around a tenant. So I think it's going to be a bit of a mix, like Airbnb is less enticing now because rents have gone up, but in some areas, because Airbnb and there's a shortage of Airbnbs on the market because less people do it, and tourism's going through the roof, maybe they can charge more. Maybe there's more people who need that short-term accommodation between rental because they can't rent something. So, there has been lots of rule changes in different states and different parts of different states, right, where Airbnb is more of a problem than others. Like there's a cap in New South Wales, for example. But I think that'd be a really interesting conversation because it is a part of the market that, either makes investing a bit more attractive or potentially makes renting harder, which is potentially better for investment. So, let's book a conversation with Kieran actually, because that's an evolving story where it's a real battle between people renting. It's a battle between the government, between owner occupiers in certain buildings who don't want Airbnb. It's a big conversation.
And regulatory changes could be a shifting part of the landscape as well. So yes, definitely warrants an episode in its own right. So thank you so much, Chris, and thank you everyone for tuning in. You can catch me at Pete Wargent Blogspot. That's my free daily blog. Or if you've really got nothing better to do with your time, at Pete Wargent on Twitter, you can send me some abuse on there. Always subscribe for the Rask podcast on your favorite podcast player. And of course on YouTube as well. And Chris, if people want to track you down at Blusk and ask you a few mortgage related questions or just check in with you, where can they go for more?
Yeah, we've had lots of clients reach out via the podcast. So there's a link in the show notes. I think it's great if you fill that in. One of the team will get chatting to you. And lots of people are just sussing out what they can and can't do at the moment, which it's a situation where you just want certainty. Like, when can I refinance? What do I need to do? Can I go back to my bank and just get a better price? And so absolutely check it out in the show notes. And I look forward to chatting to you next Sunday, Pete. And I wish everyone a great weekend.
Yes, and finally, last of all, do send us your property questions via the link in the show notes, because we do like to try and cover what you're interested in. And Chris, I'll look forward to seeing you next week when England will be a glorious 1-0 up in the Ashes, or maybe we might get saved by the rain. Let's see.
Let's see, Pete. I've got 2 passports, right? So I can pretend I can go English or Aussie, depending on who wins. So I'll make that call at the end of the set.
I actually do this. My kids are like that. Whoever's winning, that's who they support. They're very fair weather fans. So I'll have to bully them out of it. So cheers, Chris, and I'll see you next episode. Cheers.
Thanks, Pete.